Okay, thank you for your kind introduction, and thank you, Katja, for inviting me. It's an honor, of course, to be here in such a pivotal place in design history. When I was 10 years old, I spent a summer holiday at my grandparents' place, and they lived in a small house on top of a hill in the Belgian countryside. And it was a very small house. They didn't have a lot of stuff. They didn't have a TV. They didn't even have a couch. They had a table and a couple of chairs. And in the evening we played cards. And I still remember that they had this huge dark brown wardrobe in their bedroom, and on top of the wardrobe they kept these two vases. And one evening I asked my grandmother about these vases, and she took out some stairs. She let me climb them and have a closer look. And while I was looking at them, she told me that these used to belong to her mother, and that when everything got lost, this was all she had to remember her by. And I looked down and I saw she had tears in her eyes. And I said, "They're beautiful." And years later, before she passed away, she explicitly told my father that she wanted me to have the vases. Their value is close to nothing, but to me, you can imagine, they're treasures, and I'm very emotional about them. And I'm fascinated by these emotions. As a designer and design researcher, I try to understand the emotional relationship that we have with the material world. I often ask my students to bring something that they cherish, an object that they are emotional about. And the stuff that they bring is often remarkably simple. Everyday products, but the stories behind them are always rich and beautiful. Like this international student who brings her colorful bag that reminds her of her cultural values, or the guy who brings this tiny little Lego block that represents a beautiful childhood memory. And we all have them, these kind of objects that we cherish, and I bet you have them too. Maybe somewhere in a box or in a drawer, you know, maybe you don't use it anymore, maybe it doesn't even function anymore, but we hang on to them because they're part of our personal legacy. And this, of course, only represents a very tiny part of the products that we own, because the large majority of stuff that we use in our everyday life, we're not that emotional about. It's not that significant to us. So when I talk about design for emotion, people often think that I'm going to talk about these significant objects, the things that we cherish, but I'm not. I'm actually going to talk about the everyday stuff, the stuff that we use often without even really noticing it, because we are much more emotional about that stuff than we often realize. In fact, if you would consider all the emotions that we have towards design as this iceberg, then the emotions that we have towards our cherished objects only represent the tip of the iceberg. The emotions that are represented by the bulk of the iceberg, which is below the surface, are the emotions that we have towards this everyday stuff, the stuff that we are not that conscious about. And I believe that there's a lot of richness hidden in these emotions below the surface. And what I want to do in my talk is to share with you 5 insights that I gained over the years in my research about the richness of these emotions below the surface, the emotions that we have towards everyday objects that we often use without being even aware of it. To start with the first, these are what I'd like to call micro-emotions. When I ask people, tell me about the emotions that you have towards products, they often start to laugh, and sometimes they're even a bit offended. They say, I'm not emotional about products. I'm emotional about my children, about my family, not about products. And of course, we are much more emotional about our children than we are about products. But the emotions that we do have a lot of emotions towards products, but these are emotions that they are kind of ephemeral. When we have them, after we have them, they dissolve, so we forget about them. But they are there, and I'm going to give you an example. So this is my watch, and it has a step counter, so the little arm shows how well I'm doing on my daily step count. And when I first bought it, I was fascinated by this technology. And then I found out, I didn't know when I started to use it, that it actually also measures your sleep cycle. So I was hopeful. I thought, well, maybe this will help me to gain a more healthy lifestyle. And I was amazed by the technology that is hidden in this simple watch. After a week or so, of course, I got quite embarrassed to see how bad actually my lifestyle is. And it didn't end there. I had many little emotions, and that's what happens all the time. We have all these little emotions towards products that we use. And my research has shown that, in fact, we have at least 10 emotions, positive and or negative, towards every object that we use, even the most simple things like a pencil. And if you come to realize that, it's actually quite amazing. Because one day I took a picture of all the objects that I touched that were designed. And it started, of course, with my pillow. And at the end of the day, I had over 400 pictures. And these are only the products that I touched. So I didn't take pictures of the products that I only saw. And these represent then, if each one of them evokes at least 10 different emotions, more than 4,000 emotions. So just to illustrate that we are quite emotional about design, even if we're not that aware of it, because these emotions are fluent, and we forget about them all the time. And if you zoom into that, if you become aware of it, it's interesting to see how much nuance there is in these emotions. It's not just like, dislike, positive, negative. I found that there are at least 25 different positive emotions that you can have while using a product. So I'm not talking about the negative now, but only the positive. And even in the positive, there's this wide range of diversity. And I would call that a palette of opportunities for designers. If we are aware of these nuances, of these differentiated emotions, we can make use of that in our designs. And if you zoom into it, you can even see it in the hands of people who are using products. Because even though we're not that aware of it, it does influence our behavior, it does influence our thought, our feeling, and our interaction with products. Because if you're fascinated by something, you interact with it differently than when you love it, or when you enjoy something, or when you anticipate something. So it does show everywhere. It does show in how we operate products. And as I said, I think it's a palette of opportunities. So if you are aware of all these different emotions, you can be more precise in the intention that you have as a designer. Instead of saying, yeah, I want to design products that have a positive impact on people, you can be more specific. You can say, this and this and this specific emotion I want to evoke. And I have an example of that. It was a design done by Job. And he designed for children who have to go to hospital for cancer treatment. And you can imagine this is quite an emotional situation. Even more so because as part of their treatment, to avoid contamination risk, they have to be in isolation. So there's literally a glass wall between them and the rest of the world. They cannot touch other people, and this lasts for 4 days, up to 4 months. So it was quite challenging for our student to go into this situation and try to understand the emotionality of it. And of course there's a lot of suffering. But the interesting thing is that he, as a target emotion to design for, he selected amusement. Because he found that these children, they feel bad a lot of times, but sometimes they also don't feel that bad, and they just want to amuse themselves. And there's not much for them to amuse themselves with. So this is what he designed, and he explains it in a little movie.
For my graduation project at the TU Delft, I developed a game which allows isolated children in child hospitals to play with their peers. It's called Connect, and it's a game they can play on the windows between their rooms and the hallways. By combining the ambiguous shapes in different ways, you can play different kinds of games. So you can play existing games like tic-tac-toe, but you can also build your own fantasy world. To test Connect, I placed it at the oncology department of a Dutch child hospital, and this is what happened.
Oh, kijk, wee!
So what I like about this design, I think it's beautiful because it literally transforms the barrier into a playscape, into a means for social interaction. So this is what you can do if you are specific about the emotion that you want to evoke, because if he had picked another emotion, he would have come up with another design. So there's a lot of emotions to be found in these everyday objects. Next insight that I had, that it's not just positive or negative, there are a lot of paradoxical emotions. So there's something in between positive and negative. And when I had my birthday, I was given as a present a parachute jump. And it was a couple of years ago, and it was just horrible. It was just the worst experience I've ever had. I thought I was gonna die, and still you have time to think about, I just met this guy, and he's in charge of my life. So it's just a horrible experience, so I wouldn't recommend it. But afterwards, I was thrilled, you know. I thought it was just magnificent, and I still talk about it. And this is interesting because, you know, it was horrible and it was delightful at the same time. And if you look at what people do, they spend a lot of time and money and energy on finding these experiences. Maybe not as extreme as a parachute jump, but a computer game wouldn't be interesting without the frustration. You know, we watch horror movies and we pay money to do that, you know. It's not that we are forced to do that. Even a romantic comedy has to have negative emotions in it, otherwise it's boring. We listen to music that makes us sad, so we seek out these negative experiences because in some way they seem to enrich our lives. While in design, we try to keep away from that. I mean, product design. So this is one of my colleagues, he said, you should take a picture of this. We were at an airport because he said, this is such a nice example of emotional design. Look how cute it is. It's a package for coffee milk. So, you know, he made me take the picture and then he started using it and this is what happened. So I said, I need to take a picture of this too because that was too funny. But this is how we look at negative emotions in design. It's, you know, it represents failure. You want to avoid it at all costs because if somebody feels a negative emotion towards your design, you have failed as a designer. While at the same time, people seek out these rich experiences because, you know, there's beauty to be found and in the certain conditions, negative emotions can be quite enjoyable. Anger empowers us to do something. You know, when you're really angry, you dare to do things that you might not have dared before. Sadness helps us to appreciate the good. If you're not sad about when people leave you, you know, what does it mean? What does it say about a relationship? So sadness shows us the significance of our relationships and the things that we care about. Dread helps us to signify intriguing boundaries, you know. I think many of you know this experience when you see something on TV that you don't want to see and you're kind of almost looking like this, so you don't want to see it, but you want to see it because it's intriguing. So there's all these kinds of rich qualities. And one of my PhD students, he generated a long list of what he called rich interaction qualities, like the fascination of disgust, the dignity of suffering, and explored how you can use that in design. And I have an example of it, and it's the thrill of fear. And we're all familiar with the thrill of fear, right? If you're on a roller coaster, that's the thrill of fear. Maybe when I was a parachute jumping, you know, that was the thrill of fear. It was more fear than thrill, I have to say, but we are familiar with this experience. And can you use this? Can you use this to make design more interesting? And this is an example of how we used it. Again, it's a graduation project. This is a home trainer. This is not the design that I'm going to talk about, but this is one of the things that children who are blind can use to exercise. You know, blind children, they have to stay fit, so they have to exercise, and there are several solutions for that, one of them being a home trainer. But our student found that blind children really hate to exercise. And why is that? It's because it's so boring, you know. This is boring even to an adult. Can you imagine for a child to do this? So what she did is she explored how can we enrich through this kind of fear, how can we enrich the experience of exercise? And this is what she came up with. It's called Link, and as you can see, it's a big ball and there's a net inside. And for blind children, this is super exciting because they can go in all directions. Normally they cannot do that, and they can move freely, so they're not held by a hand. And when we tested this, some children were very cautious, you know, that was a lot of chaos they could deal with, but there were other children, like this little boy, who were running around in this ball. And it was beautiful to see because, you know, some of the parents who were there when we tested it, they got quite emotional. They said, wow, I've never seen this kind of enthusiasm and energy in my own child. So this is how enriching experiences can actually help us as designers, going beyond the, you know, simple positive, negative distinction. That's the second insight. The third insight is that, and I'm calling it layers of emotion because it represents the idea that a lot of the emotions that we have towards designed objects are not really about the object. They're about something else. So this is my nephew, and I took him to this climb wall, and we both did it, and for us it was both the first time, and we had a lot of emotions. Again, there was this fright, but there was also proud that we did it, and enjoyment, and of the social activity. So it was quite an emotional situation, but none of these emotions was actually literally directed to the wall. It was more about the activity, about the context of doing this that evoked the emotions. And this is something that, you know, my design students often are not that aware about, because when they are designing, they're focusing on the object that they're designing and they're thinking about the emotions that you could have towards that object. You know, so what emotions can I have towards a scuba diving snorkel, goggles? Well, in fact, you should be thinking about the emotions that people have while they're using it. Much more emotional. And as a designer, you can think, yeah, but these are not the emotions that I can design for. But it's not true. The interesting thing is that you can actually represent these emotions. If you're good enough as a designer, you can represent it and you can make it part of the actual design. And you can take these activities and design for them. So you can not only design a product, but you can design an activity through products. Here's another student project, and this was called Unikeys, and it's designed for children with and without physical disabilities. So this was for a school that hosts combinations of children. So some of them have physical disability and others don't. And it's quite challenging to have them to play together because of the, I don't know, the social boundaries or something like that. So the challenge of the students was design a game that is stimulating these children to play together without having this feeling of having to kind of compromise their play. So what it is actually, it's a game in which each disability represents a superpower. For example, if you are deaf, you cannot hear, but you can use sign language, so you can communicate over long distances. I could actually communicate with someone outside if I have visual contact. So that's a superpower. And she said that every one of these disabilities represents a superpower. So in this game, the children with the disabilities are superheroes. The children without disabilities, they can also get superpowers, but they have to invent them. So altogether, they're inventing these superpowers, and they're building it through everyday materials like, you know, aluminum foil, rope, balloons. So they're in this play game together, creating superpowers. And they have a lot of fun while doing it, and forgetting all about this distinction between disability and ability, because it all becomes superpower. What I love about this design is that, you know, it's not a fancy design. Our students, she said, I don't want to design something that people have to pay a lot of money for. All it is a sheet of paper with some instructions, and you use the stuff that you already have in your home. For me, this is also design. So you can design activities that evoke powerful emotions. And you can also look at activities to understand what emotions are present and try to make it relevant for the design that you're working on. This is an example of one of my own designs. This is a breakfast for intercontinental flights. It was done for KLM, so this is not my design, it's a conventional design. And KLM found, not surprisingly, that the emotions that people have towards this breakfast are mostly negative. You know, and people don't like it in many different ways. So they invested a lot of money. They worked with these famous chefs to improve the recipes, and the result was that it became much more expensive, and still people hated it. So they came to us and they said, can you do something to improve the emotion without making it even more expensive? So we said, well, we have to, you know, take a step back and look not just at the breakfast, because in the end it's going to be made in a factory and heated in a little oven, so the quality is not going to be high either way. We're going to have to take a step back and look at the emotions that people have in the activity, in the context of flying. So we measure the emotions of people on board of intercontinental flights. And not surprisingly, we found that there were two main negative emotions. The first is kind of frustration or anxiety because of the lack of control. You're in that plane for 10 to 12 hours and you're stuck in a chair. There is very little control that you have. So people start to get anxious about that. The second is boredom. You know, you've read your book, you've watched a movie, you've watched an old episode of Friends, and you start to get bored, you know, because you need to be stimulated. So we said, this is what we're going to use in our design. And then KLM said, yeah, but you're not talking about the breakfast, you're talking about, you know, the flying experience. And we said, well, the interesting thing is we can make it relevant for the breakfast. So in the end, this was the design. It's called Morning Tapas, and it has all these different elements, and in the middle it has condiments, and it's designed in such a way that when you open it, it explains that you can personalize your breakfast by combining things in many different ways. So you kind of play with your food, so that gives some entertainment. You can play with your food, that's fun, and it also gives you control, because you can decide how you want to have your breakfast and in what kind of combinations. The result was that the emotions were much more positive, even though the recipe didn't change that much. So I like this as an example because it illustrates that if you take a step back and instead of thinking about I'm going to design a glass and think about I'm going to design something that enables someone who's going to give a talk for a conference to stay hydrated, you might come up with much more kind of interesting emotional designs. So I think that was the third insight. The fourth is that emotions are often about dilemmas. So I started off by saying that there's a lot of nuance in positive emotions, and the second thing was that there's not just this distinction between positive and negative, there's also something in between it. And then the fourth was that you have to take a step back and look at the emotions that we have in the context. And these emotions are often not that straightforward because they conflict with each other, and that's a huge design opportunity. Again, an example. So this is a wheelchair for children. This is a conventional model, and we measured the emotions that are evoked by the wheelchair. We measured both the emotions of the parents and the children. And we found that, surprisingly, the children had quite a negative emotion to one part of the wheelchair that we did not expect to evoke a negative emotion because it's a part that they don't even use. They felt contempt towards the handles at the back. Because, one of their concerns is, I want to be independent, and having these handles sticking out of your back, it really expresses you are a dependent person. And we didn't expect it, we didn't see this coming. The parents, on the other hand, they were quite happy with these handles because one of their concerns is that they want to be able to push this wheelchair in a comfortable way, and big handles provide comfort. So there seems to be this conflict between the parents and the children, but it's not. There's no conflict. The conflict is generated by the design. There's no conflict between comfort and independency. It's the design that generates the conflict. So all you need to do is make a redesign and the conflict is resolved. So this is the redesign, and of course it changed in many different ways, but one of the things that she did is she took off the handles and she made a handlebar. And what you cannot see in the picture is that when the children are not being pushed by the parent, they can slide down the handlebar, and it's hidden behind the seat and it's unrecognizable as a handlebar. So it doesn't express this dependency anymore. Both the children and the parents loved it, so the emotional dilemma was resolved. This is a dilemma between the parents and the children, but we also have them internally. We have dilemmas within ourselves. And maybe some of you recognize this as an example. You want to stay fit, you don't want to get too fat, so you decide not to eat dessert, and then you see the chocolate pie and you kind of, ooh, it does look good, doesn't it? So that's an internal dilemma. And we have them, psychologists have shown we have them from the moment we wake up to the moment we fall asleep, we have them all the time, these little dilemmas. Constantly, ooh, on the one hand this, on the other hand that. And that's an interesting platform for design innovation. So here's another example, mom's breakfast routine. So on the one hand, the breakfast is a time that you can spend with your children. After that, you have to go to work, they have to go to school, so it's an important time, and it would be nice, to have some time with your children. On the other hand, you also find it important that they have a healthy breakfast, so you don't want to, give them processed stuff. You want to prepare the breakfast with fresh ingredients. But if you want to do that, you need to use kitchen utensils like the ones in the picture. And these are not typically the kind of products that you want your toddlers to be around. So you're with this dilemma, I should put them there and do my cooking here, or I should give them processed food and then I can be with them. While in reality, this is not really a dilemma, because you can also see it like this. If you see it like this, there's this design space that opens up opportunities for innovation. So there's the option C, enable children to help with fresh ingredients. So Lotte Jacobsen, this is what she designed. It's called Cook It, and it are a series of cooking utensils that toddlers can use. So very small children, they can use it to help their parents to prepare breakfast. And they use it in the way that toddlers like to play, so they can smash things, it's very rough, but it's specifically designed for that. So you resolve the dilemma by enabling the children and the parents to have a meaningful moment while preparing a breakfast with fresh ingredients. So I'm almost with my, at the end of the talk, so this is the final insight, and as I said, as the title said of my talk, from feeling to well-being, you know, I've been studying emotions that we have in relation to design for the last 15, 20 years, and more we started to realize in our research group that, you know, there is this emotion in the moment, but there's also this more long-term well-being. And can we also develop knowledge that enables us to design for well-being? It's slightly different, it's related, but it's different than emotions. Is it possible to also design for sustainable well-being? And I think it's an interesting question. So that's the question that we ask in the DIOPD, the Delft Institute of Positive Design, and we have only started to do this research. But I think it's fascinating. So I have much more questions than answers when it comes to design for well-being, but I think it's fascinating. And it kind of connects to a lot of the things that I talked about before, you know, the dilemmas, the richness, and etc. But still we need to develop new methodology for this. This product is an existing product. It's called a bag snagger. And I love the story because I heard the story on the radio. It was an interview with a guy who used to work at Wall Street. And he made a lot of money working at Wall Street, so he retired, and then he had lots of time. So he started making these long walks in Central Park. Every day he made a long walk, and he enjoyed it a lot. But after a while, he started to notice that there are sometimes plastic bags hanging in trees, and once he started to notice it, it started to annoy him. Because the people who clean the parks, they can clean the park, but they cannot reach the bags in the trees. And because he was so annoyed by it, he devised a thing, which was basically a stick with a hook, and he started taking that on his walks through Central Park, and he took out the bags himself. And then in the interview, he said that at some point he came to the realization that he now was happier than when he was working at Wall Street. And it's interesting because that story inspired a company who makes products for, you know, park rangers to create a professional version of it, which is still basically a pole with a hook. And that inspired people seeing other people doing that. That inspired these little communities in the United States of volunteers to go bag snagging in the weekend. And I think it's interesting because I think there's a lot of well-being in there because you contribute to the community, you're doing something meaningful, it's a social activity, and it's not only enabled by the product, but it's also kind of inspired by it. So this stick doesn't make people happy, but it does, you know, create a platform for an activity that can make you happy. So one of the things that we did, together with my colleague Anna Polmeyer, we created this framework for positive design, in which emotions, having pleasurable experiences, is one of the pillars, because having positive emotions is truly a condition for well-being, but it's not the only condition. Also, having a sense of significance, feeling that what you're doing is meaningful, that it leads to something, that you're growing as a person, is another of the pillars, design for personal significance. And the third pillar is feeling that what you're doing, who you are as a person, is virtuous. So design for virtue, I think, is a very powerful means to design for well-being. And I think it's quite interesting to explore how can we design stuff that enable people to be virtuous. This is one, I mean, it's more of an experiment than it is a real product that we did. It's a piggy bank. And Santiago, one of our students, designed it. It's a digital piggy bank. So what it is, it's a little device and you combine it with your smartphone. So when you put your smartphone in a device, it becomes a piggy bank. And it helps you to manage your savings. It starts by you entering a saving goal. So you can say, I want to save money for a pair of hiking shoes. And then it monitors the saving over time. And at the same time, not only giving you feedback on how well you're doing with your saving, at some unexpected moment, it prints these little labels. So it sticks out its tongue, and it prints a little label and asks a weird question. It asks a question about the thing that you're saving for, the hiking shoes. So it asks, how is this going to help you to grow as a person? So it makes you reflect on how is this going to be me? How is it going to help me to be a better person? Or how are these shoes going to help you to contribute to the life of someone else or to the community? How is it gonna help you to improve the relationships that you have with other people? How is it gonna help you to increase your mental and physical vitality? So these are the kind of questions that if you are more aware of it, that make you, if you reflect on that, on how products are actually not just objects, but platforms for becoming a better person or the best person that you can be, it can actually connect the thing that you are using towards your well-being. And I think we saw that when we were testing this device, that it really had some amazing effects. Like some people said that they started off with saving for something, and then during the process they discontinued. They said, I'm not going to save for this anymore because it's not meaningful for me anymore. So they reflected on what they want to buy, and they changed their targets. So I think that in the end, design can never generate well-being. It's not up to the designer to determine which of the objects that people use or own will become cherished. It's up to the user, of course. But by doing it in the right way as designers, we can help people to buy the stuff that actually can end up becoming cherished. So at the Institute of Positive Design, we develop all these tools and techniques. And I thought it would be nice to show you because we believe in sharing. So everything that we develop is open access. For example, we have an emotion typology that shows a lot of different emotions, and you can use it to kind of train your own emotional granularity, get to know the distinctions between different emotions, and it has lots of examples, movie clips, and etc. Another thing is we have these card sets. You can download, print, and cut it out, card sets of different positive emotions, and it can be used as a creative tool. It can be used in the communication with the user when you're doing user research or with the client to be more precise about the emotion that you're working on. So most of the stuff is on the website of the diapd.org, and then there's this tools section. You can download these things. So I've reached the end of my talk. I didn't keep track of time. I don't know how I'm doing. But before I end, there's one more anecdote, one more story I'd like to tell, because I think it's a beautiful story. And it's about the wheelchair. Because this wheelchair, this was, when I started teaching in Delft, this was the first graduation project that I did with one of my students. So it's actually quite an old design. It's 18 years old or something like that. And I use it a lot. I always use it as an example of emotional design because I think it explains it quite nicely. So I also use it when I give lectures to our students. And the prototype in the picture is on display in our faculty. And one day I gave a lecture to first-year students, and after the lecture, and I showed the example, after the lecture, one of the guys in the picture, let's see if I have a mouse pointer, yeah, this guy, his name is Bart. He came up to me after the lecture, and he's in a wheelchair himself. And he said, thank you for the lecture, and I really like the example of the wheelchair because I knew already about that wheelchair. And I thought, yeah, that's possible because it's on display in our faculty. And then he said, now I've known it years before I came to Delft. So I said, that you have to explain to me. And he told me this story, and I had never realized this. He told me this story that when Eva designed this wheelchair and built a prototype, she went to a primary school to test it with children. And that was his school. So he said that this lady came in with this wheelchair, and then she told us, the children, that she designed it herself. And he was so amazed and inspired by that, that at that point he decided, I want to become a designer too. So now he is in our faculty studying to become an industrial designer. And I think, it's a beautiful example that illustrates how design can actually inspire people to become their best possible selves. Thank you very much.